I'm going to switch things up and try to stay over here. Got some notes too. So first of all, I wanted to thank the committee for inviting me to be part of this panel. I really appreciate the opportunity to be in front of kind of a different crowd for me. I'm usually in front of fire managers or community leaders, and so it's been great to be part of this science kind of focused community, and I really appreciate the kind of change in perspective that it's offered to me. So first of all, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about myself. My name's Medley-Daniel. I grew up in this community of Hayfork, which is depicted on the left there. It's a really tiny community of about 2,500 people in the geographic center of Trinity County, which is in far northwestern California. You can see the outline of Trinity County there on our fire history map. And that fire history map is something we actually created with our community in 2009 when we updated our community wildfire protection plan. And we've had a number of significant fires since then. But as you can see, like, this is a pretty fire-prone environment that I grew up in. And actually, the very first experience we had with our community, I was about 7 years old, and my dad was interviewing to be the high school math teacher. And he came to the interview and wanted to bring back a souvenir to his kids. And the only souvenirs available in our community were wildfire T-shirts from the Lime Dyke complex that had happened 2 years prior. So our community has a lot of relationship with fire. The organization that I work for is the Watershed Research and Training Center, and it was started in 1994 as kind of a response to changing rules around logging. So our community had been a logging community for the past 75 years, and when the public lands management was changing around logging, we said, well, we're going to lose 40% of our payroll overnight when our mill turns off. So we need to reimagine what we're going to be if we're not going to be a logging town. So we've been on that journey for the past 20 years, and fire is playing a major role. You can see these are some of the fires that were not depicted on our fire history map. This is the 2015 fire season, which was a big wake-up call to us. This is where I really started realizing that smoke was going to be a huge factor and a huge impact. On our community, we had almost an entire month of smoke that looked like this. We didn't get to go outside, and we had a lot of those conversations around, like, that was a summer that never was, and I think we started thinking about fire not only in terms of its impacts on our surrounding resources, but on the psychological and mental health impacts to our community, which was basically socked in for that entire month. So I guess the other thing I'd like to say about this, though, is you may think, well, we need to put these fires out. Dave already kind of went over this, but putting these fires out is not actually going to help us. We do need to have some suppression capabilities, and we need to be addressing fires in a dynamic way, but we have excluded fire primarily from our landscape, and certainly in the landscape I live in, we have a 5 to 15 year fire return interval, and so putting out every fire is just going to make it, is just going to pass the buck onto the future. So we really need to be thinking about how we can accept more fire and manage and mitigate for the impacts of it. So to do that, we need a new wildfire management paradigm. So this is one of my favorite papers and sort of a foundational piece of how I understand living with fire. So our current fire paradigm, or sort of the dominant fire paradigm, has been this war on fire. We need to stop fires, we need to put them out. And what we're really trying to do is figure out how to transition into this new fire paradigm where we're trying to work with fire as the change agent in many of our landscapes and think about we as human communities and how we're adapting to that or not. Yeah, thanks, Dave. That's awesome. So how are we going to move from a war on fire kind of approach to sustainably coexisting with wildfire? So to do that, we have to start taking action before, during, and after fires. We need local capacity and a culture that includes a relationship with fire. We have to acknowledge that every community's experience with fire is going to be different. Every community's landscape and their social dynamics and their economies have different ways that fire will influence those. So this is kind of a framework around fire adaptation, and that's the work that I actually do at the Watershed Center. So, you know, to get to this prize, we really need to have people working together and sharing different ideas. And so about 6 years ago, we decided that we needed to start a network of communities around the country who were trying to live with fire. This is something that lots of communities have been trying to adapt to, but we didn't have a lot of connectivity. We talked this morning a little bit about the isolation that many communities experience, people trying to think about, well, what are the things I can do to adapt the economic drivers of fire in my community? Those are complex ideas, and especially in many rural communities, there aren't a ton of resources available for people to work on these things. So we decided we needed to launch a network to help community leaders really think about a new way to live with fire. And it doesn't just include rural communities. It's a nationwide network that includes folks all the way from the New Jersey Pinelands to folks in Austin, Texas. We have many members in Washington, and we've actually grown several state networks out of the effort as well. But the key kind of questions we asked ourselves in launching a network were, how could different people from different kinds of places that are working with different institutions demonstrate what living with fire could be? So we really wanted to have that broad range of different models of living with fire. And then we really wanted to also ask the question, if we build this network, can we catalyze a movement toward living differently with fire? And so 6 years later, we've learned a lot about what that means. So these are some of the partners that work on our networks together. So up in the top corner there, we see the Nature Conservancy, we have the U.S. Forest Service, and the Departments of the Interior. Those folks all work with the organization that I work for, the Watershed Center, to host this family of networks. And so we have the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. That's the network that I get to run that is working with communities across the country. We have something called the Fire Learning Network, which was started about 17 years ago, and is really focused on thinking about landscapes and fire and dynamics that are mostly ecologically driven. We have an Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, and so you guys heard from Don yesterday. He's actually part of that effort as well, and we've learned so many amazing things from the folks in that network who've been able to share their traditional burning and cultural burning practices. And then we have a program called the TREX, which is a prescribed fire training exchange, and that's a really important component because part of what we've realized is that because we can't exclude fire, we need to learn how to use fire. And so we also need to get trained to do that. And so it's really hard if you're not a federal fire manager in our country to have access to get training and become qualified to actually use and engage with fire. And so TREX helps provide that access to other people. So what does FACnet do? We provide experiential learning. Up in the top corner there, you can see that's actually a women's TREX event where we're trying to have more access for women to be in fire. So we have those experiential opportunities. We develop a lot of materials that help describe the models of living with fire that different people are demonstrating within our networks. We engage a lot with federal land managers and fire managers, and we try to help tell stories and show partnership with them. We have a blog that publishes every week, and there are actually a ton of really great stories on there, often written by community leaders, but also we really encourage and want to engage more with researchers and want that to be a platform for there being more connections between researchers and practitioners. And then we support a lot of different just on-the-ground projects in our communities. So we have here, folks who are taking on specific planning projects, who are doing Firewise workdays, like Dave talked about. There's a whole bunch of specific programs that NFPA and the International Association for Fire Chiefs run that communities can engage with. And so I want to tell you a little bit about a couple of the communities that I think can maybe be North Stars for us as we try to look forward in what our relationship with fire could be. So the first one is are some folks that are a little bit even north of me, which is hard to believe in California that there is north of Trinity County, but it does exist. So the folks up on the Mid-Klamath in the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership have amazing work going on. They are really, in my mind, the embodiment of what co-management of fire and landscapes looks like. They have a lot of amazing assets that go into that. So they have a very tight-knit and small community. They have amazing tribal influence, and the Aboriginal territory of the Karuk people is where that location is. And so there's a lot of traditional knowledge that still exists there about how fire should behave in that landscape. And so I think that's an amazing asset that they have. They've been really focusing on creating intergenerational learning opportunities, and Dawn spoke to that a little bit yesterday as well, the importance of figuring out if we really want to do culture change work, how are we passing this down to the next generation? They have done a planning process where they have values-based planning to help them sort of overcome conflict. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So, you know, when I thought about talking about treatments today and like the treatments on landscapes and how those affect our relationship with fire, the folks at WKRP were the first ones that came to mind. They have a very similar, they're in our same eco-region, that fire map I showed you at the very beginning. They would have a very similar fire map every 5 to 15 years, having large landscape scale fires. But they are really trying to embrace figuring out how fire can play its role in their landscape. So rather than saying, how can we protect just our community, they're saying, how can we let fire play its role in this landscape and make sure that we're not being negatively impacted, but we're also not in the way of that function happening. There's a lot of really important benefits to the fish populations that Dawn was also talking about yesterday, and just really important dynamics for making that kind of ecosystem function where you need fire. But this didn't come easily. About 5 years ago, they were in a situation where they were actually having protests around projects. So you can see from the picture, and this is actually a story that's on our blog, so if you are interested in this, I encourage you to check it out. They had been working for years with the Forest Service to try to design a stewardship projects, and all kinds of things went awry, and it basically ended up where they were gathering community members together to protest work and go to court to litigate, basically. But before that happened, they said, well, maybe we should see if we can get some facilitation in here and see if we can find a common path forward. And they were able to do that. Some of the folks in that partnership I was talking about with the Fire Learning Network were able to come in and sort of help them go through a process of values-based planning. So I touched on that a second ago, but it really was transformative for them. So they did a process called the Open Standards process, which is something that the Nature Conservancy does around the world. But basically, it's an opportunity to help community members identify, what do you care about? Let's show that on a map, and let's overlay that with what other people care about. And pretty soon you start seeing that your environmentalist community members who are concerned about your spotted owl cores are also caring about the same place that your ranchers are concerned about. And you start to see opportunities where you have shared interest and the opportunity to maybe make some treatments and to take some actions together. And so through that facilitated process of coming to a new idea about what they could do together, they are now working on implementing, you know, huge landscape scale projects and have a really great partnership with the Forest Service. So they've really overcome a lot in the last 5 years. Just to tell you a little bit more about the benefits of values-based planning, because I think this is something that other communities can learn from. Some of the most important things related to this are that in any values-based planning process, people need to be gathering, honoring, and using local information. So this isn't just about crunching big data. This is about really engaging with the residents, finding out what they know, what their vision is for how that landscape should be treated. And it's about figuring out how to visually display that knowledge and have conversations among the community members about it. So there's a lot of cool technology that you could use for this, but that's the key element, is that people get to speak about their values and that those become displayed visually in an overlay with other people's. And then what they're doing based on some of the initial work they've done there is actually bringing in really cool models that help them think about how they could manage wildfires moving forward. So not only are they using this method to design proactive projects where they agree now, but they're actually using it to decide, okay, when we get a wildfire start, under what conditions would we maybe let this burn into a certain area? And so they're trying to take this sort of several steps further, and there's really exciting, I think, progress that's to be made there. So the second thing story I wanted to bring you in terms of a community relationship to using treatments to move forward their shared vision of living with fire is kind of back to Hayfork, so back to my hometown and our story. And you know, when we started out, I alluded to this earlier, we were in a time of crisis. Our entire community had been based on the logging industry. We had 2 shifts running at the mill day and night. My dad was working at the high school, and we had 300 high school students. When I graduated 15 years later, there were 30 students in my class. So there were major, major impacts to shutting down the mill. Now, I'm not saying that wasn't the right choice, but we had to really figure out how to adapt. And so the Watershed Center that I work for was started to really try to address how are we going to turn from loggers into ecosystem managers. And I think I've been there for the last 10 years, and I think the most marked change I've seen is that we've really recognized that it's not going to be just about changing from being loggers to maybe being able to be wood utilizers, but to thinking about fire as a big part of what our workforce is going to need to do. So you can see in the picture there, we have our youth crew. That's an amazing kind of opportunity that we've developed. So many of our students don't necessarily want to go to college. They want to be in technical careers, and we try to create tracks for them. And then we have our crew there that's working with our volunteer fire department. So we don't have a lot of workers in our community. We have 2,500 people, and it's hard to get a workforce together. So sometimes we do a lot of job sharing, and we try to get a variety of different people to come together to actually create the workforce you need to implement a project. We cross-train these folks, so they don't do just one thing. We need these people to know how to do everything in the woods. We need people to be able to clean up the trespass cartel grows that are going on in our national forests, and to put fire on the ground, and to thin the forest and create a fuel break. And so that's what our people do. And it's, I think that's where you get a cultural change as well, is when people are relating to that landscape. They are making that, the care and stewardship of that landscape their life's work. So this is the view from the other side of my valley. So the first picture I showed you was from our south lookout, our south fire lookout, and this is from our north fire lookout called Hayfork Bali. So my vision is that in years to come, when the next lightning bust of 2015 happens, and we get a whole new set of fires, that we are more prepared, that cross-trained workforce is ready to get, has already done a bunch of work and is ready to get out on the ground and help not need as much support from outside fire suppression, that we have realized some of the benefits of treatments that we've collaboratively designed, and that our local workforce is the ones doing the work. So that's what I'm hoping for. And just to give you a real quick smattering of some other work that's going on across the country in the FACnet, I just wanted to highlight a couple of the other kinds of work that people do. So we do evacuation drills, living with fire events, harvesting demonstrations. We have folks using a tool called the FACSAT, which is a Fire Adapted Community Self-Assessment tool that we've built to help communities think about what kinds of work they need to do and where they might want to prioritize and focus their time. We have community ambassador programs that are designed around helping to build neighborhood leadership and connect those people to one another and support them. We have smoke outreach and healthcare and business and residential connections that people are making. We have folks working with their chambers of commerce to think about, you know, how is smoke impacting the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, and what are we going to do if our economy relies on that and we are going to have smoke. We have folks that are working with expanding tribal engagement and really thinking about who the indigenous people in their communities are and trying to reach out to them and think about what are the cultural fire practices here. And then we have a number of states that are really thinking about how to densify this network and get more people engaged and excited about a new way to live with fire. So we're supporting potentially 9 states in having statewide networks. And so I just want to kind of close with a couple of final thoughts. So we can have a better relationship with fire. And I know we've heard for the past 2 days some really gripping and striking impacts that fire can have, but I think that we can recognize those and address them and honor those things while also thinking about fire in a way that it can have beneficial impacts on our lives as well. But in order to do that, we have to invest in local capacity, and we have to redistribute power in our fire management system. We have to recognize the roles that local community members can play in ecosystem stewardship. We need to be recognizing our responsibility to fire-adapted landscapes, and we need to make these shifts in ways that will support local economies. So thank you so much for your time.